congestion in Newcastle city centre and other cities, particularly in the mornings and early evenings. Rush hour was terrible, absolutely terrible. So they needed stuff doing. But I remember when it was being built, I used to be again on the bus, and there was still congestion with the metro works going on. But at the same time, Northumbria Water Authority were putting this huge interceptor sewer in through Newcastle. So when I was sitting there, people knew I was on the council, and they would complain about this metro. Look at all this. I said, oh, it's the Water Authority. They're putting an interceptor sewer in. Of course, they didn't realise I was a member of the Northumbria Water Authority as well, so I had a foot in both camps, and I just kept bouncing the blame off each other.
So the five of us, well, the P-Way chap joined a little bit later, but the five of us moved into an empty office in Cuthbert House, and got our drawing boards out, and that's where we started work. And one of the things that soon became very apparent was that you couldn't make any decision on how you were going to move your part of the project forward without discussing it with the other disciplines. Like the overhead line affected the tunnels, and the P-Way affected our distribution system. It was a good team effort. It was totally very interesting in that, I mean, often in an office, it gets political and competitive. But there was none of that, certainly not in the early days. We were there as a small team, and we got on with the job. And it was a very good, well, I mean, it was a project of a lifetime, but it was a very good atmosphere in the office. And as it happened, it was right by the railway, so you got trains going past. And including what we used to call the Bangers and Smarty train, which the original line ran out to Callerton by the airport, and also called at Roundtree. So it collected explosives from the depot at Callerton and Smarties from the Roundtree's factory, and you could smell the Smarties as the train went past, But yes, it was a good job to be involved with. But when the PT itself was in the process of applying for the money and getting the bill, they'd employed a firm of consultants to, in fact, do a simulated train run around what the system was going to be. And that gave us the idea of the first loadings. We had the parameters of the car that they were thinking of using, and that then was run around the system. That gave us electrical loadings at various points, and then we could align that to the overhead system. I mean, we produced a proposal for various voltages, 750, 1000 and 1500. But 750 obviously meant twice as many substations, and that's why we settled on the 1500 volts. It reduced the current in the actual overhead, which meant we could use standard AC electrification equipment. We decided that it was going to be virtually two systems, in that we could put traction substations around the system, but for the central area, as we called it, we had a main substation at South Gosforth and two satellite substations, one at Old Fold, one at Byker, and they were fed by cabling through the central area and through the central area tunnels. So we had a compact power system for both the traction and the stations. And the 11 kV rings fed alternate stations so that you catered for the loss of one of the circuits. It was quite a complicated system. My main concern was getting people out of the tunnels if there was a fault. And nothing's worse than being trapped underground, stuck in a train that's not going anywhere. And consequently, although we might have been considered over-egg the pudding a little bit, we knew that whatever happened, and even if we lost South Gosforth, we had an emergency supply that we could close at Jesmond, at the edge of the city centre tunnels. We could get people out. It was not going to be like Manchester has, to go to street running. So the other option then was the tunnels. And, I mean, the tunnelling system, both north and south, and the east-west tunnels, were a major part of the cost of the project, without a doubt. But it was decided by the chief engineer that that was the best way to provide the service, and also avoid, whilst there was a bit of a disruption in the city centre with the stations, that would be nothing to ploughing up all the streets to put trams and doing that sort of thing. And in fact, we run under where Northumberland Street, which of course is pedestrianised now. So that was what was decided. It did cause us some problems from an electrification point of view, because there's not a lot of room in the tunnels for hanging the overhead, but we came to a tunnel diameter that suited both the rolling stock and us, and getting the laid track in the invert of the tunnel as well, because that's another factor that affects the ultimate diameter. And seeing that the cost goes up as a cube of the diameter, it's quite a crucial dimension. The tunnels on the south side of the river were slightly different because the fact that it was going through coal measures, but we had existing tunnels and no shields, and that got very tight. We eventually finished up putting tunnel arms in because you couldn't get any other form of insulation. They were Victorian tunnels, and it was tight. It's not dissimilar to on the Sunderland line, because that used British Rail alignments, and that goes through tunnels when you cross the River Wear. So there's always some sort of problem. I mean, it's not always straightforward, but that's engineering, isn't it? You're there to solve problems, and that makes it interesting.
Right, so all started at South Gosforth car sheds in on the 24th of the 11th, 1980. I've even got my old contract of employment, would you believe? I mustn't have chucked it out, right? Well, never mind. Anyway, I've still got it, and it was a very difficult time. We had the lads from the BR were transferred on, and they didn't want to be on, right? We were transferred in, and we didn't want to be on, right? So we were all like put together. It was a bit of an unholy marriage of different trades and attitudes of how the train system or whatever should be run. Anyway, so we just had to get stuck in and try and keep the trains running. One of the biggest, we had Metro Camel, who built the trains, practically camped out in at South Gosforth at the time, sorry, at the car sheds at the time, along with GEC, because the trains were troublesome. I can put it that way. And anyway, a lot of the problems related to the trains is because they didn't get tested properly. There was only a track in middle engine lane that was about 1.5 miles long, and it really wasn't the success that they thought it was. And we're getting a lot of problems with the track and the wheels, and the track was wearing out when it shouldn't have been wearing out, and the wheels were wearing out very rapidly, and there was huge problems associated with all of that. But eventually all that was slowly getting solved, along with all the other issues with the trains. I can remember me and my colleagues actually riding the trains during the day with our tools and a pocket full of door locking systems, door locking pads, because the doors were breaking the locks off at the bottom, right? So as you were going along the line, the doors were flapping about like, how can I say it, like a bird's wing, right? So that was our job, just going around it, riding the trains on the system, checking the doors, then getting on the next train and checking the doors, and so on and so on. Then another set of colleagues would come on the next shift and we'd be doing the same. So they were really pushed to keep the trains rolling. Then we had problems with the overhead. The pantographs were wearing very rapidly for some reason or another. The carbon pads, and this affected the overhead, and there was a few instances of the overhead getting pulled down. Then what else was going wrong? Well, anyway, they've managed to get the wheels sorted out by bringing in a wheel lathe from Poland, and that was installed, and so they were busy reprofiling the wheels and the flanges, which were wearing very rapidly due to the state of the track. So as fast as they were doing the wheels, they were having to do the track, then the track was having to be done, and the wheels were having to be done, and it was a constant battle to keep them going. I have to say, looking back, it's 40 years now. I think all the traction maintenance people at Gosford are doing a marvelous job keeping these 40-year-old trains running, because it's because they kind of get the parts, and they're having to cobble things together to keep them going. And so there was a lot of issues, but everybody eventually gelled together and started working as a team. But that took considerable period of time before that happened.
It was absolutely tragic, because the mines were closing, the shipyards were closing. I was involved in transport actually, because I was at a meeting down in London about freight transport, and I'd had a lot of complaints about the freight from the mine, which is at the back of my house, was at the back of my house, down to the shipyards, and the noise of the trains clunking around all night. And somebody said to me, "Oh, well, you don't need to bother about that, because we're closing the mine anyway." And that was the first I'd ever heard of it. And I came rushing back to South Shields, went to see the chief executive and said, "Look, I've just had the tip off, they're going to close the mine." It was, what? So that was quite a shock that I came back with that news. And then that started happening. I was also involved with David Clark over the closure of the shipyards, because he was the MP at that time. And that was absolutely tragic. I mean, the place was decimated at a stroke by the Thatcher government.
the unions were incredibly important in ensuring that we got delivery. I remember another thing that he'd said, that my ambition is that the bus staff, bus drivers, you know, and engineers in the Northeast are the best paid in the country outside London. But I want better productivity than anywhere else outside London, and more flexibility than anywhere outside London. And that was the negotiating stance, that I'm prepared to fight to get the absolute best for you. But the side of the deal is I need to be able to afford that, and I need that from productivity, and I don't want days lost from strike. And I think because of his upbringing, he knew exactly how to talk to unions and had very good relationships with people. I wouldn't say buddy relationships, but professional relationships, he had them. I'll tell you one story, which was one evening. So very often he'd come in, and certainly he and I would have a chat. Not a long chat always, but he'd often talk about something that happened during the day. And this day we knew was going to be really important, because it was one of the darkest moments. That it was the South Shields. Certainly at this time, it was the funding for the South Shields branch of the Metro. So that was on hold, and they'd got the last ditch. So Linda Chalker, who was Minister of Transport, she wasn't Minister for that long. So she came up for the day with some other officials, and they were to have the trip down that line along the South Bank. And the councillors and the officials had their chance to sort of make a case. And he said it went from bad to worse. And he got the sense from the beginning they were just going through the duties, presumably because local politicians had put the weight on that this had to happen. But a moment of magic happened. They were at Chichester Station in South Shields, or one of the stations down there, and for whatever reason, someone decided to take them into opened up one of the old station buildings, and everyone came into this, and it was dust, it was muck, it wasn't pleasant, it was cold, and anyway, out of nowhere, a little mouse appeared. Skipped around, and it caught everyone's attention, this mouse, and it clambered up on some boxes or tables and actually stood there and just looked at the minister. And he said that changed it. He says whatever happened, she realised, because they'd been going about how poor things were, she wasn't happy at all about this. But from then on in, there were like, no, there are lots of problems here, and a conversation started, and they got the funding. They got the funding.
And it wasn't until the 1985 Transport Act, where we had to implement the Transport Act in 1986, that we lost control of the integrated transport system, which was a fantastic system. You know, it was the Gold Star the Gold Star system. People from all over the country used to come to Tyne and Weir to look at our system, you know, because of it was a fantastic example. We had the transfer system, where you could buy a ticket and go from bus to metro to ferry on one ticket, and everything linked in together. And of course, once the 1985 Transport Act was implemented in 1986, that just all went by the by, because everybody and his dog who had a bus came on stream. And I remember the first day it was activated, in those days, the offices for the PTE were in Cuthbert House on the end of the Tyne Bridge. And I remember standing watching all these buses coming across the Tyne Bridge, hundreds of them, all different shapes and sizes, completely inaccessible. So it was an absolute nightmare. But then it settled down over the years, and then the major bus companies took control. The likes of Stagecoach, Go Ahead and Arriva, and that's what we have really running the transport system.
And what Nexus has always done, you know, I had 2 children. My hours were really built around my children. So the part-time job was about 15 hours a week. I think when I went on contracts, I went up to 26 hours a week. And school liaison, obviously you have, you're not so busy in the holidays, so you can adapt your working hours. So it wasn't really until I took public affairs that I probably went full-time working, and the rest, because, you know, as you probably know, when you work with all different kinds of stakeholders, there's no such thing as a 9-to-5 job. You're on the job all the time. I think it's just like the railway, you know, was always historically a male-dominated place to work, industry. And people are changing now, you know, it's great. You're seeing women engineers in all walks of life. You're seeing people thinking outside the box now, and it works both ways, you know, like jobs that were, you know, normally thought of as a female job, you get men working in them now and vice versa. And I always say it's the best person for the job, and everybody should not let anything restrict them. Go for it if they think they're capable of doing it.
If you ask me what pleased me most about the Metro, was generally the public were very good and appreciative of what you did. Like I say, 99% of people just want to get on the train, go from A to B. You only deal with the 1%. I also liked, when I was a train crew manager, when I became the train crew manager, it became obvious we were going to have a problem with retiring train crew. A lot of the train crew all started at the same time, so they were all due to retire at the same time. So we literally had an ongoing recruitment campaign for the whole time I was a train crew manager. And what we used to do is, it was really led by HR with us, with the operations department. We would put an advertisement out, we'd get over 1,000 people reply. Each application was read twice, once by someone from operations, once by from HR. They were given a score, and those at a certain level were invited into the next stage, then the next stage, the next stage. And out of those 1,000 people, we may have ended up with 50 people in a bank, and 8 at a time they would come in to do their training. And to me, I really enjoyed telling someone, you've got a job. Without being funny, in the early years of this going on, all this recruitment, a lot of the people who got jobs doubled their wages. You know, they were just lads or lasses who maybe worked in a shop or did whatever they did, and they didn't get paid a lot. Then all of a sudden they doubled their wages. And you know, that's a great feeling, seeing someone think,
I made a decision right from the start that if Nexus was going to have a profile, we needed to always have a fringe meeting or fringe event at the party conferences, particularly the party conference of the people who were in power, but we also the leading opposition. And so we had anyway fringe meetings at the Labour Party conference, which we organised with speakers, and often, you know, a junior minister or shadow minister or whatever. So we said, right, we're going down there, going down to Brighton or wherever it may be. John Prescott, send him an invitation. How about you coming that evening, and we'll take you out to dinner. And we were not restricted if he wanted to bring his wife, if he wanted to bring his PA, whatever, we didn't mind. Come with your, you know, with your assistants. And so the chairman of the PTA and I basically entertained John Prescott with a pure single objective of to getting him to understand what the Sunderland extension was about, and eventually to get him to support the Sunderland extension. And I always remember he was a very, very talkative man, John Prescott, or wasn't he was. I don't think he's very well at the moment. but he would talk 9 to the dozen, so it's often very difficult to get in and say anything. But he still managed to eat a plate of fish and chips at the same time. He was everyone who knows John Prescott knows he's a huge character. Anyway, we did this, and I made sure we did this every year. And so each year, once a year, we saw John Prescott. And it became the regular Tuesday dinner, so that he, as he became more important, had it always as Tuesday in his diary at the Labour Party conference. And that went through from when he was Shadow Secretary of State, to when he was Secretary of State, to when he was Deputy Prime Minister. The disadvantage when he was Deputy Prime Minister is you also had to entertain the security man. And we carried on after the Sunderland Metro was built. We didn't want to upset the thing. We carried on right the way through. Certainly, I think right the way through till I left Nexus, and that absolutely paid dividends because we got eventually a very good relationship with him, and so much so that I could help him. I helped him on one particular occasion, a very important occasion, because the Sunderland extension was the basis of funding. The proposed funding was what's called a PPI, a public-private initiative, which was all the vogue at that time. But it wasn't particularly popular on the left of the Labour Party, and we were going to, PPI was the way forward for the Sunderland extension, and PPI was used by the Labour government in all sorts of areas to increase infrastructure building, and it was opposed by the unions, and there was a big debate that Prescott was due to speak on. He was due to present on transport, and one of the very well-known union general secretaries at the time was a guy called Jimmy Knapp, who was the general secretary of the RMT, and Prescott knew that he would give his statement about Sunderland. Well, he'd give his statement about public transport, general transport, as Secretary of State for Transport. He knew he was going to give his statement. He was going to give a speech at the Labour Party conference, and then other people would get up and question him or attack him or praise him or whatever, as happens in a normal conference debate. He knew that Jimmy Knapp one of the first speakers, would be attacking him on PPI, and but what I was able to tell Prescott, because in the earlier lobbying, not only did I want to obviously we've got all the councils supporting us, we got all the local MPs supporting us. We actually got all the trade unions supporting us, of course, including Jimmy Knapp, who I got to know quite well while he was General Secretary. And so he actually sent me a letter of support for the Sunderland extension. So I was able to tell Prescott, I was able to say to him, well, tell you what, if you're worried about Jimmy Knapp, I've got a letter here that I can show you that is from Jimmy Knapp supporting the Metro extension to Sunderland. So Prescott was absolutely gleeful at that. And so he could include in his speech, he could preempt Jimmy Knapp's attack by saying, Jimmy Knapp supports the Sunderland. But the great thing from our point of view is that not only did he say that, he actually said in his speech, and we know it was not in his original script, which was probably written primarily by the civil servants. He said, and we're coming to the Sunderland extension, which I support. And that absolutely, I was coming back from the conference in the car with the chairman, or I was on the train, I can't remember. And I just went, yes, because I knew that we got him, and that the civil servants would now be much more positive in the dealing with us, because the Chief Minister had demonstrated that he supported the Sunderland extension. So that was on the lobbying side. Of course, lobbying is all about, you try and get everyone to support it. And of course, local residents along the line of route are very, very important. And we did a lot to try and encourage, to inform local residents of what the benefits were and what the disruption would be during building and all that sort of thing, to try and get all the local residents. We didn't get all of them on side. One or two people who had houses very close to the new bit of track were not very pleased, worried about noise and things like that. And we tried to landscape, things like that. But by and large, we got support everywhere. And but getting the Secretary of State to give his support was tremendous. With Europe, it was a bit easier. Funnily enough, Neil Kinnock, former leader of the Labour Party, he was actually the commissioner for transport in the European Union, and it was relatively easy to go and see him. Again, I went with the chairman to Brussels, and we saw him, and there were one or two people who knew him and knew us, who helped facilitate that. And if you like, the European side of it was relatively easy. So they provided a very significant grant towards the building of the Sunderland extension.
There was this job come up called the school's liaison officer. In the school liaison officer job, I was like, wow, I want to do that job. And I thought, right, I put about 3 weeks of studying, looking at different railway operators, how they looked into how they established the education side of the railway system. I looked at schools and what the curriculum was up to. I had a look at my sister's a teacher, so I kind of bent her ear a little bit. What do you do in your job, and how do you get kids to learn, and how do you get them to listen, and da-da-da-da-da. And I thought, I'm going to get this job. And I remember somebody on the station said, you'll never get that job. You're not qualified to do that job. And I says, who needs qualifications? I know I can do that job, and if I need the qualifications, I'm willing to study to get the qualifications. And he was like, nah, you'll never get that job. And I remember there was about 7 up for interview, and there was a couple of external as well as internal people. And I put a full week's effort into trying to get this. We had to do a presentation for the interview on how we could stop antisocial behaviour on Metro. So I put my whole effort into this presentation, put it all on a PowerPoint presentation, and presented it to the interviewees. They loved it, and they liked me honesty. They liked the fact that I was willing to do anything that needed to be done to stop antisocial behaviour, to educate kids on the system, etc., etc. And I got the job. And I remember walking past this person, and I went like that, kind of stuck my tongue out to them. I says, who said I couldn't get that job?
One of the big things that's always held the Metro back was that until 2010, there was never a long-term funding plan. It was an annual go down to London and see what you come back with sort of arrangement, which doesn't allow you to plan long-term very well. And I was determined that at some point we'd get a sort of long-term funding deal, both capital and revenue, which allows us to plan and deliver something. So that was Metro reinvigoration. That's what that was all about. That was how Metro reinvigoration was born, really, from that attempt to get long-term funding.
And that included station renewal as well.
Yeah, well, it was 350 million capital over 10 years and about 300 million revenue over the same. So we had something to work with. The two interesting things about that is that I worked the team doing the submission very, very hard, because I knew if we didn't get approval before the general election in 2010 or 2011, we got no hope. So we got it in. Gordon Brown took it forward. Sadiq Khan was the transport minister, and we got it approved. I think about 3 months before the general election. It was quite close, but the team, they worked the socks off, and I was pushing them because I knew that if we didn't get it approved by a Labour government, you've got no chance.
It's very accessible. If you can take a wheelchair onto the metro, or even just I remember when we first started with the 1985 Transport Act, and they were bringing all the horrible different buses on. There were coaches and things with really high steps coming onto systems. And I remember my youngest son was coming from school waiting for a bus, and he said there was an elderly gentleman who was disabled, and the bus came and he couldn't get on because the steps were so high, and him and his friend had helped this guy onto the bus, and he said he was worried about how he was going to get off at the other end. But that was a lesson to me, that we can't have these buses. Now we've got kneeling buses and better accessible buses, which is much better, which we've fought for, we've campaigned for. But the metro has always been really accessible, and with the new trains they'll be even more accessible because there's a plate drops down, so there's no gap. There's a small gap anyway, but there's a plate going to drop down, which means there'll be no gap at all.